Today we'll be talking about how to integrate applications, external applications into Content Hub. My name is Akshay. You can reach me on any public channels if you need any help or help in the community in general. So there's two ways primarily of integrating into Content Hub. One of the ways is a REST-based API. The other one is more of an SDK. The REST-based API is very straightforward. Just like other REST-based APIs, you have access to quite a few of the API calls. You can mix and match API calls to fit the need of what you're trying to achieve in terms of functionality. And really, you don't have to bring in any NuGet packages or anything of that sort. You just authenticate using an endpoint, hit different endpoints for different pieces of functionality. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's it's like a recipe for baking a cake. So you could make the batter for the cake, but you can make muffins if you want. You could make pancakes if you want with the same exact batter. REST-based API has quite a bit of documentation, and in general, Style Labs documentation is pretty thorough. And I think if you go through their training, the documentation would make sense, and you're able to use the documentation. And especially if you have access to their an instance of Content Hub, it would make it a lot easier as well. So with any API call, authentication is at the forefront of it, right? So you need to make sure you create a user for the API, make sure the user has enough permissions. You also need to create or use an existing OAuth client as part of the authentication. So when you ask for an authentication token, there's several ways to do it. The way which is probably more secure is you use a user as well as an OAuth client as the authentication parameter. So you're using two different things. You authenticate, get the token, and use the token to make subsequent calls. Again, any of these API calls should work with any client you're trying to integrate it with, as long as the client is able to make HTTP calls out. So just to give you an example, you can absolutely do it via Postman. And if you can do it via Postman, you can do it in plain HTML file with JavaScript if you like. If you have an IoT device, the implications, you could pretty much use it anywhere from a REST API perspective. There's also a JavaScript API, JavaScript SDK, which I have not used myself, but it's there, and I just wanted to mention, and there's documentation on it, but I haven't really gotten into it. There's a web client SDK. Now, this gets interesting because it is external libraries you're pulling in, so you would add it via a gated NuGet feed. You add these libraries into your application or your project. So these are basically .NET Core based libraries. Again, if you need to bring in these libraries in, which means you have to use, you don't have the freedom to put it in any application as you want. You would have to consume the NuGet feed, but there's already pre-built functionality set in these libraries, so you don't have to worry about creating a client to make the HTTP call, authenticate. So most of it is bundled. The web client SDK also lets you make raw API calls directly if you choose to, on top of what the functionality it offers, but it just in general makes it easy. You don't have to worry about the wiring up of simple things, but it takes care of the job. It's more like a boxed cake. So it has all the ingredients you need. You just have to mix it and put it in the oven, and you're done. Like the API, Web Client SDK also has quite a bit of documentation. It helps a ton if you have your own instance, and also you need access to the authenticated NuGet feed, because right now it's only available if you have access to a portal for Style Labs. So once you do get access to it, though, you have all the APIs. They're updated pretty often. So the one I'm using right now, I think it's 335, was updated a couple of months ago. So they're keeping on top of it, and it's very useful. And again, just like any other API NuGet feed, you just pull it via, if you're working in Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio, you should be able to pull the NuGet feed in pretty easily and use it. There's a couple of examples. So this one is a little bit older, but it kind of gives you an idea of exactly how to use the Web Client SDK. They have a few examples of creating an asset and trying to modify an asset. But again, it's pretty useful if you want to go take a look. I have not added anything to this feed, but Chris does have his own feed. I need to put up his the Content Hub Guild URL for the Git. So he's putting the updated code which he comes up with for dealing with PIM or DAM. So that's available as well to start off as a code base. An interesting thing. So like going into Content Hub, it's a bit different way to think of things. So we are predominantly in the CMS world. So we tend to look at content from a very web perspective, but when you're trying to get into a content hub mode, you need to think of content as being agnostic. It doesn't, you can't just think of one channel you're pushing content out of. You think of multiple channels. So, the same piece of content, you're running a campaign to launch a car, for instance. You'll have pieces of content which are used in the web channel, which might also be used in a social channel, syndicated to a third-party website, for instance. So you're using bits and pieces of the same content in different channels where the content goes through, as well as using different pieces of content for different channels as well. So it becomes a little bit difficult once you start working with content hub, because you're tending to focus mainly on the web channel, but you need to think of it as separate from the web channel. So one of the things which is pretty interesting, and we'll try to get into it a little bit more, is all the entities. So there's three main entities, m.pc, m.product, m.content, and m.asset. M.asset is for a DAM asset. M.content, when you attach a content type, is a CMP, content marketing platform, and then the PCM, product content management, m.pcm.product is the main entity. And there's several other entities and things you need to relate to. So the way it's done, with going back to old SQL days, so one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many kind of relationships. So every entity can relate to other entities, and it's pretty easy to do that. And then you do that using a relationship object when you're building an entity or updating an entity. So that's something which I wanted to mention, and we'll take a look at a representation of that. So demo, so let's take a look real quick. So before I get to that, I just wanted to quickly go over this. So not sure how many, I know it's quite a bit of seeing the screens in Content Hub, but I never truly see an actual demo in Content Hub. But I'll try to quickly run you guys through Content Hub before. So you have your startup screen. Again, you can pretty much customize anything you see, any action which happens, what the user gets, everything is customizable. But this is basically like the admin panel. There's a countless amount of things you could do with it. I'm not going to go through all of it. But the main one to call out is content types. Those are the content types which are related to CMP, content marketing platform. So you have, from your Sitecore perspective, think of it as a template, but you're adding a type to a template. So You have a piece of content. If you can make that into a blog post, you could make that into an author, an article, a news item, whatever you need to. The content types is where it all happens. You use a lot of schema in terms of manipulating how entities are dealt with. So if you need to add more fields, update existing fields, you would do that in there. So you have users and authentication, and you also have taxonomy where if you have something where you have a hierarchical lookup values, topics or categories, for instance, you'd probably dump them in taxonomy in order for you to go through things. And then we have several, so if you're dealing with products, again, you're dealing with a different entity in products. If you're dealing with assets, you deal with a different entity inside of an asset. The UI itself is pretty simple once you get used to it. And again, any and all pieces of what you see for a specific entity can be controlled. So by default, you have quite a few attributes, and these are some custom attributes I added for some testing. You can put them in panels, like how they're grouped over here. The ones on the right are basically the system, and for the content types, you'll see a details tab, but essentially what most of them are system generated when you add a piece of content. And rights management and so on and so forth. And then the same applies for a CMP piece of content. So here I have a content type called as a user group. You can see a difference. So the stuff on the left are your content fields. These fields are predominantly text, rich text. You could attach media to it if you choose to. And then on the right, there are system fields, but these you can extend as well. So right now you have a very important field called audience. So this is where you specify almost like a persona in Sitecore, which region does it go to, so you can segregate your content for that. You could set publication dates so that it can automatically get published. And then you could here, so details as well is very extendable. So you could add additional attributes to this, absolutely, and you can play with it the way it suits you. So it's almost like a template definition. So if we go into content types, by default, you get all of this minus the user group. User group is something which I created, and promotion is something which I created as well. So it's separated into two. One is the content portion of it, and there's only 3 types of fields you can add from the content portion. So content portion is what was on the left side when I was showing you a user group piece of content. But the details on the right can be extended using quite a few different types of fields, and these are fields which are a little bit more complex, need processing, something which you probably won't touch as often, or we have like image processing or events taking place when things happen to a piece of content and we're automatically doing this, or metadata related. So things like option lists. So these are essentially drop downs. If you're dealing with anything which is less than like 10, 20 items, you'll probably do option lists. If you're dealing with anything more than that, or you need hierarchical view, you would probably deal with taxonomies. You could add provisions in here to link yourself to a product or a different entity like an asset by adding reference to it. So there's quite a bit of manipulation you could do in these to add the fields you're trying to choose. And when you get back into actually using these fields, you will see that they'll show up, all the content fields show up here, and then you could have all the details on the right side. That's a general overview of Content Hub. Each piece of content can have different workflows. So you can set up workflows in here as well. So just show you real quick. So for now, what you're seeing here is this piece of content I'm pushing through different workflows. So to review, you could approve. And once you approve, several things can happen, and then you can go back and modify it. Assets have a workflow, PCM products have a workflow as well. So, and all these workflows are modifiable. You can do things inside of these. So there's these thing called triggers. So based on a certain modification of a specific piece of content or a or an entity. So for instance, here I'm trying to, if I see that the status of the piece of content goes to the final status, then I want this to trigger. And when it triggers, I need it to trigger something called as a CMP Azure action, which basically puts a message in a queue for me to do whatever I need to. So in this case, this was done for the CMP connector for Sitecore. So this drops a message saying, hey, by the way, a piece of content came into the final state, and then the CMP connector just consumes it. I think that's pretty much most of what the Content Hub I wanted to show. So let's go back in here, back over there. So what I have is I have a piece of a sample application which I created to test out and Content Hub for different APIs, as well as to push sample data as well as existing data from customers. So this has the capability, once you have all your settings, you should be able to push things over. So what I'm going to do is right now I will create, actually that's wrong. I'll create a user group item, and it's fairly simple, not complicated. Let me just copy paste a little bit. And then we'll walk through it. So it says it's created. Let's have a look. There you go. So again, it didn't take a lot of time. And this is also a test instance. So once you're dealing with a production instance, it's much faster. Test instance is fast enough, but API is super simple. Didn't really take that much time. So what I do, there's different ways of working. Some people work using their using Visual Studio Code, which works actually pretty well because most you working with the script files. If you're working with Visual Studio Code, if you're writing scripts which are specific to Content Hub, which are run on Content Hub itself, it's an easier way to test it. Chris uses that a lot. I predominantly work a lot on migration and integration, so I love working on the Visual Studio itself. It's again a .NET Core project. Not a lot of dependencies, as you can see. It's pretty straightforward, and I usually like pushing things into Azure queues and then running the functionality from Azure queues. You could absolutely have a local application which does all of this. It's exactly the same APIs you would call. You would end up consuming the m.sdk.web client. But for me, the reason I chose Azure Functions is because, especially when you're dealing with status checking tasks. So for instance, when you look for something like an asset, and in the asset itself, you are trying to push an asset. So for DAM, the easiest way to populate or migrate assets is by public URLs of the asset. So you're setting the metadata and you're basically adding a job saying, hey, this is the asset I just added. Go get the URL for this image or PDF or whatever your asset is, video, and that would be the asset for this. What happens is you create a fetch job, which is essentially right there, but it might take time right? So for instance, an image which is less than a meg might be done in a few seconds as opposed to a video which is 150 megs. So you have a job which is just sitting there checking. So every 15 seconds, every 30 seconds, it needs to keep going on and checking if that asset is done uploading into Content Hub. And once that's done, you have to create a public link for that asset. So because there's a lot of waiting at times, especially to do with assets. So for things like PCM products or content, CMP content, it's pretty straightforward. You just create. So for instance, this where we're pushing a JSON of all the data I entered in the form into an Azure queue. It goes into this queue, you pick it up, you connect to Content Hub. I'm trying to impersonate a user. The reason being is that if you have workflows associated with an entity, for instance, you want the workflow to follow the user's path. So if I add it as a super user, then it'll be, I might not be restricted based on the workflow, but we want to do it as a specific user, for instance, so that we follow the workflow, then that's the best way to do it. Again, trying to create an entity, and these are all just values for what each things are. And again, I have them as constants instead of having all sorts of strings. And if you have an attribute, so none of these attributes are culture dependent, they're all just plain attributes. But if I have a piece of content or an attribute or a property which needs locale specific, there's an override on this where you could pass the culture with it. For now, these are not, so I don't need to pass anything. So we are basically filling everything in, getting everything ready, and then we need to tag the content type. And this is where I was talking about being able to associate one entity with other entities or types or relationships. So it's pretty easy to do that. To relate. So this one is child to one parent, that you could have parent to many children, many to many, one to many, similar relationships as you would have to a database. So here we're trying to set a content type, we're trying to set a content lifecycle, we're trying to set an approved state for this piece of content, and then push it into content type saying, okay, now I'm ready, save it. And all of these are just values. So if you take a look at this as well, everything is a value, and these will be nodes inside of the schema itself. So if we go back in here, this is our entity ID, which we just created, and there's a clean way of looking at it. So for the entity which is represented by this, essentially we are able to take a look, the name, and then you see the field values here. And the field names don't look pretty because these are user generated fields, which we just added, right? But these are the fields out of the box for blog, for instance, for any content type, which are specific to blogs. So again, this is our ID. We're talking about relationships. So you can see here, it has multiple relationships, not just the ones we added. So by default, it adds entity relationships, but we were trying to add content type to content, which you can see is a user group. You can go to that entity, which is a content type entity of type user group, and take a look at its references when it was created. So you get quite a bit of metadata. So when you're dealing with these API calls, you can come back in here. Even if you didn't know what was going on, you could take a look. So these were the labels which I was trying to show you, which represent some of these values I had. So it kind of tends to get a little bit easier once you start getting into it. It's really not that hard. And each one has its own URL, as you can see. So you can get into different types. And if you need IDs, so this is a relationship type, for instance, and then you could get you could link it to another entity or another type by doing that. If you have tags, taxonomies, pretty much almost the same. So if you're struggling with something to do with API, I first come in here and do it visually. So if I need to link to audience, for instance, or add a bunch of tags, I do it on here. Take a look at what happens or how it looks inside of this API entity. So the same entity representation instead of UI like this. And when I'm in trouble, I kind of take a look. I'm like, oh, okay, this is how they're doing it. They're doing it with that relationship. And we have to link to a parent being user group, and its entity is this. So you kind of figure out that you have to have a relationship with a parent who's of type content type, and we need to give the entity ID for that specific piece of content. So in a way, it gets a little bit simpler once you start using it. Again, I think I don't really have much I can answer your questions. We have a few webinars. So if you go to konabos.com/webinars, we have a couple of webinars scheduled in this upcoming month. We have two. So Supercharge Your Product Strategy is essentially dealing with content marketers and people who deal with content. It's not really developer specific, but essentially walking through how exactly does Content Hub solve the problem with for people who deal with hundreds and thousands of products, assets related to those, dealing with DRM, dealing with which piece of asset needs to go into which channel, dealing with product data integration, bringing products in. Look Before You Leap is another interesting webinar. This is predominantly dealing with everything to do with Content Hub for people who are considering Content Hub, who just got Content Hub, who are waiting on their domain model being implemented on Content Hub. So the walking through of what to expect, what's the flow of from the time you are trying to make a decision to when you make the decision, get Content Hub, you're waiting for your domain model to be implemented, the walkthrough of what happens in terms of dealing with Sitecore Content Hub team, the migration, the strategies you need to use. So if you can, please go register. It should be a good series to listen to. I also have a symposium presentation. I hope you guys are registered for symposium. So this one's talking about the Content Hub connector, which we didn't get into because that wasn't part of the scope, but there are DAM and CMP connectors, which you can integrate with your Sitecore XP, so that, or XM for that matter, which will pull assets. So the DAM connector gives you the ability to pick assets which are in DAM instead of your media library. So media fields or text fields, you should be able to select assets in DAM, whether they're images, PDFs, whatever they are. Same with Content Hub, you are able to bring in. So we just saw a user group type, right? What you could do is in your XP, you could define a template, or if you already have a template of type user group, you're able to map, hey, this is my template on XP. This is what I have on CMP. You map the fields together and you set up the configuration. So every time a piece of content gets triggered on Content Hub, you will get a new item or an updated item inside of an item bucket, which corresponds to that piece of item. So you could write your renderings to look at that bucket and maybe render them. So this is another good talk. If you guys have interest in Content Hub, you can absolutely watch it. And again, I should not be difficult to reach. You should not hesitate to reach me if you need help, Slack, or anything in community in general. You're trying to run a user group, SUGCon, whatever that is, absolutely go ahead and reach out to us. And we've been producing quite a bit of content on Content Hub, pushing it to our YouTube channel. So you can subscribe there and follow us, and I'll be more than happy to help any of you working on it. So with that, I will stop talking. And if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Akshay. Anyone has any questions?
Wow, I must have done a good job. Or what people are watching cricket match, one of the two.
Yeah, I wouldn't bet on either. So, yeah, I think we actually lost quite a few people also in the past, just in the last 5 minutes. I think the match just started now. So,
Oh, okay, that's fine.
I think,
anyways, yeah.
I think most of us are really new to this. We
Okay.
are like more interested into watching what is there in Content Hub, and most
That's
probably,
nice.
Akshay is always there to help us. So we'll be reaching out in person to seek any help.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much, Akshay. That was really awesome. And yeah, you're always an motivation for us.
Oh, I try. You guys probably do more work than I do.
All right.
All right, guys. Thank you. Have a good rest of your evening.
All right.
Yeah,
Thank you so much,
thank you so
Akshay.
much.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye.